My own daughter erased me from the family, said I wasn't fit to be a grandmother. 3 years later, I rescued a boy in the storm, only to realize he was the grandson she'd hidden. I held a $1 million check in my hand, and this time, I made the decision. If you think this is just another family story, you're wrong. Hit subscribe so you never miss more shocking episodes like this one. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt toast and linseed oil. Sunlight crept in reluctantly through a dust-mottled window pane, casting a weak square of light on the cracked linoleum floor. Evelyn Monroe, wrapped in a faded burgundy cardigan that had lost its buttons, and memory of warmth, sat hunched at a folding table cluttered with old sketch pads and water-stained paintbrushes. She was carefully filling in the petal of a marigold with trembling fingers, each stroke of color deliberate, each pause a meditation. She lived alone in apartment 4B. No pets, no visitors, just the persistent drip from a leaky faucet, and the radio murmuring from across the room, her only daily companion. She didn't mind the silence. Not anymore. Silence had become a second language after Gerald passed. In fact, she preferred it to the hollow echoes of phone calls that never came, and birthdays no one remembered. This morning, like most mornings, had started with the ritual: 2 slices of bread half burnt, a mug of black coffee, and a fresh attempt to finish the painting she'd begun 2 months ago. An unfinished garden scene that had once been meant for her grandson's bedroom. Then the radio voice changed tone. Evelyn glanced up. "In other news," said the host, "today marks exactly 1 year since the passing of Portland real estate icon Gerald Monroe, whose controversial legacy continues to spark debate over housing equity and historic preservation." Evelyn's brush halted midair. The tip hovered over the canvas like a breath held too long. She hadn't forgotten the date, of course, but she hadn't expected to hear his name spoken so casually, folded between weather updates and traffic delays, reduced to an icon, as if he were never a husband, never a man with sun-worn hands, and a half-smile he only ever showed her. She stood slowly, the chair scraping against the floor with a groan, and turned off the radio with more force than necessary. A year, 12 months, 365 days of watching the world move on without her. The funeral came rushing back with blinding clarity. She could still feel the wind that day, sharp, impatient, the kind of chill that blew through bones rather than skin. Carla had organized everything, a sleek, expensive service with an open bar and closed hearts. Gerald's face was printed on programs in a tasteful gray scale. A quartet played Vivaldi. People she barely knew hugged her too tightly, or not at all. But what Evelyn remembered most wasn't the flowers or the eulogy. It was Carla's hand firm on her back, steering her away from the casket like she was some frail woman who needed redirecting. "Let's not make a scene," Carla had whispered with a politician's smile. "Daniel's here. He doesn't need to see you upset." Evelyn had blinked, stunned. Not make a scene. Her husband of 43 years had just been lowered into the ground. What exactly was the appropriate expression for that? She remembered trying to hold her grandson's hand, Daniel, age 6, with Gerald's eyes, and how Carla had gently but decisively pulled him back. "Mom," she'd said tight-lipped, "I think it's best if you keep some distance. We're trying to minimize stress for Daniel." And just like that, Evelyn had become toxic, a contaminant to be kept at arm's length. The image of her daughter standing tall in sleek black sunglasses, perched like armor across her face, lingered like smoke. Carla had thanked guests with the grace of a senator accepting condolences, as though collecting campaign donations. Not once did she look back at Evelyn, who stood in the corner of the cemetery clutching her purse like a lifeline. She hadn't even been allowed to ride in the family limousine. Gerald would have hated all of it. He'd wanted to be cremated, scattered into the Columbia River. A jazz band, not a quartet. He'd wanted Evelyn to read something she wrote herself. But Carla had intercepted every plan, citing optics and family cohesion and the boy's emotional well-being. Evelyn had been pushed to the perimeter of her own life. Back in the apartment, she returned to her seat and stared at the marigold. She dabbed the brush into orange paint and smeared it across the canvas without thinking. The color bled too wide too fast. She didn't bother fixing it. She leaned back and stared out the window where a single pigeon waddled along the edge of the fire escape. Below, the street hummed with the low drone of a delivery truck reversing its beeps, punctuating the morning like Morse code for the lonely. She reached for the drawer beside her and pulled it open. Inside, neatly stacked, were 12 birthday cards, each one addressed to Daniel, in the careful cursive she had perfected as a school teacher. Not a single one had been opened. Each had returned with the same cold label, "Returned to sender." She slid her fingers over the envelope at the top. It was blue, decorated with stars, and contained a watercolor she had painted of an astronaut waving from the moon. She'd written on the back, "To Daniel, shoot for the stars. Love Grandma Evelyn." But Daniel would never read it. He likely didn't even know she existed anymore. Carla had made sure of that. Evelyn looked around the room, her eyes landing on the framed photo of her and Gerald at Cannon Beach, 1987. He was wearing that ridiculous straw hat he refused to throw away, and she had sunscreen on her nose. They were laughing. God, they were happy. She could still hear his voice sometimes, especially when she worked on her paintings. "Too much green," he'd say. "Your trees look like they're jealous of something." She smiled despite herself, then blinked it away. The apartment was quiet again. Too quiet. She thought about calling someone. Maybe her old friend Marianne, who lived 2 floors down and still hosted Wednesday night bridge, even though none of them remembered how to keep score anymore. But Evelyn knew how that conversation would go. Marianne would ask if Carla had returned any of her calls, if she'd seen Daniel. And Evelyn would have to smile and shake her head and pretend it didn't matter. She stood and walked toward the small hallway that led to her bedroom. On the wall were 6 framed drawings, portraits of children, each with wide eyes and oversized smiles. They were her students from the last year she taught art at Jefferson Elementary before retirement. She remembered all their names, remembered the way they'd leave crumpled notes on her desk that said, "Ms. Monroe, I like your shoes," or "Today was fun." But there were no portraits of Daniel. She'd never had the chance to draw him, because every photo of him Carla had ever sent was blurry, cropped, or filtered, if she sent anything at all. As she passed the mirror, Evelyn caught her reflection and paused. 68, she thought. That number didn't feel real. Her reflection stared back lines creasing around her mouth. Eyes smaller than she remembered, hair streaked with silver like a storm rolling through. She touched her cheek. "I used to be someone," she whispered. The words surprised her, because they were true. She had been a teacher, a wife, a mother. Now she was just an afterthought. Just then, from outside the window, a child's laughter rang out. Evelyn stepped closer and peered through the slats of the blinds. On the sidewalk below, a boy chased after a paper airplane, his coat flapping behind him like a cape. Evelyn's breath caught. For a moment, just a moment, she imagined it was Daniel. But Daniel was somewhere else in a house she wasn't allowed to visit, living a life she wasn't permitted to witness. She returned to her chair and picked up the brush again. The marigold looked ruined. She dipped the brush into the water jar, watched the orange swirl into brown, and started over this time, painting something entirely different. Not flowers, not gardens. She painted a boy in a raincoat standing alone at a crosswalk looking up. She didn't know why. She just knew it felt important. The kind of image you don't understand until later. The kind of moment that changes everything. And in the distance, faint but growing louder, the clouds began to gather. A storm was coming. She kept them all in an old shoebox beneath her bed. The birthday cards, the holiday letters, the hand-stitched bookmarks, the soft blue mittens she'd knitted after reading in a parenting magazine that Daniel had started refusing his gloves. That shoebox held 6 years' worth of attempts to remain visible, to be remembered, to be something other than a fading silhouette in her grandson's life. None of it ever reached him. The post office labels were always the same: return to sender. Not at this address, or the colder, more bureaucratic delivery, refused. Carla had made sure her mother's love was officially undeliverable. The first time it happened, Evelyn had thought it was a mistake. People move. Addresses change. Surely Carla had forgotten to forward the new one. But then the second package came back, and the third. By the fifth return, Evelyn had stopped writing cheerful notes on the back of envelopes. She still wrote the cards she needed to, but she didn't pretend anymore. She no longer drew smiley faces in the margins or signed "Love Always" in curly cursive. She just wrote his name, plain, almost like an epitaph. On the envelope of the last card, she wrote simply, "To Daniel, from the grandma you never got to know." The weight of that sentence had kept her up for 3 nights straight. It wasn't that Carla had said, "We don't want you around." No, Carla was far more surgical than that. It was always cloaked in what's best for Daniel. It started with fewer phone calls. Then holidays became complicated. Then birthdays were tight on time. Eventually, the silence became standard. Evelyn wasn't uninvited. She was omitted like a mistake that kept getting quietly erased from the margins. Carla's language was always measured and polite, as if the exclusion could be softened with etiquette. "I just think Mom," Carla had said in their last real conversation, "that your energy, the emotional load you carry, it's not healthy for Daniel." "My energy," Evelyn had repeated, blinking. "You mean my grief?" "Gerald just died, Carla." "I'm aware," her daughter had replied coolly. "And so is Daniel. That's the point. He doesn't need to absorb your sadness." As if grief was a gas. As if Evelyn was radioactive. Evelyn had wanted to scream, but she didn't. She just nodded and pressed the phone harder to her ear, as if her husband's voice might rise from the other side instead. Now, a year later, she stood outside Jefferson Elementary's auditorium, gripping the invitation she wasn't supposed to have. Marianne had passed it along. Marianne, the downstairs neighbor, who still played bridge and still kept an eye on school bulletins. "It's tomorrow night," Marianne had whispered over a teacup. "Spring Arts Showcase. Daniel's name is in the program." Evelyn had stared at the flyer like it was a photograph of the moon. "You could just go," Marianne had said. "But Carla," Evelyn began. "She doesn't own the school, Evie." That was how she found herself pressed against the wall of the dimly lit auditorium, a silk scarf wrapped high around her head, sunglasses hiding her face, even though it was 7 in the evening. She looked like a woman fleeing the press, which in a way she was. Her heart thudded with every footstep. Every time the door opened, she flinched. The program crinkled in her lap. Line 17, Daniel Monroe, solo piano performance, Claire de Lune. Evelyn nearly cried at the title. Gerald used to hum that piece while cooking. Now his grandson would play it. Somehow the world had come full circle without her. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the small crowd of parents, siblings, and teachers. A girl in a blue dress recited a poem about clouds. 2 boys danced clumsily to a Taylor Swift song. Evelyn smiled, barely breathing. When Daniel walked out onto the stage, the air left her lungs. He was taller than she remembered. His hair was longer, flopping slightly into his eyes. He wore a dark navy blazer and a red bow tie, Gerald's favorite color. He sat down at the piano, cracked his knuckles like he'd seen professionals do, and paused. Just for a moment. Then the music began, soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. Claire de Lune. Evelyn didn't realize she was crying until she tasted salt on her lips. She closed her eyes and listened, not just with her ears, but with her whole being. It was like hearing Gerald again, reaching out through time, telling her, "I'm still here. You're not alone." When Daniel finished, the room erupted in applause. Evelyn clapped too quietly, afraid to draw attention. She wished she could run up to him, wrap him in her arms, and whisper how proud she was. But she stayed seated in the dark behind a pillar. Then came the final act, a family introduction according to the program. A school tradition where students introduced their family members in attendance and said a short line about them. Evelyn hadn't known this part was included. She started to gather her things. But then Daniel's name was called. He returned to the stage with a slight blush on his cheeks, waved awkwardly at the audience, and turned to the microphone. "I'm Daniel Monroe. That was my piano piece earlier." Light laughter from the crowd. "And my family is here tonight. My mom, Carla Monroe." Evelyn stiffened. Carla. She hadn't seen her walk in. Had she passed her in the hallway? Had she been there the whole time? And my little sister Olivia. "What?" Evelyn blinked. A little girl no more than 3 or 4 with dark curls and a glittery headband was standing beside Carla, clutching her leg. She looked exactly like Carla did at that age, except for the eyes. The eyes were Monroe eyes, Gerald's eyes, a second child, another grandchild, never mentioned, never acknowledged, erased. "I love them very much," Daniel said. "They always support me." The audience applauded. Carla smiled broadly and waved. Evelyn gripped the program so tightly it tore. A little sister. There had never been any announcement. No call, no photo, not even a Facebook post. Evelyn checked obsessively. Carla's accounts were curated, and public image was everything. But Olivia had never appeared. It was as if the child had been born in secrecy, shielded from Evelyn's world by design. Her hands trembled. Carla hadn't just erased Evelyn from Daniel's life. She'd built an entirely new version of their family, one that Evelyn didn't belong to. A polished three-person portrait of smiling perfection. Evelyn rose slowly, clutching her purse, and slipped out the side exit before the lights came up. The night was cold, Portland cold. She didn't bother with her scarf this time. She let the air slap her awake. Back home, she opened the shoebox and pulled out the latest card she'd written Daniel's upcoming birthday. She tore it in half, then in quarters, then in pieces so small she couldn't recognize her own handwriting anymore. She sat on the floor for a long time afterward, not crying, not raging, just still, numb. Eventually, she stood and went to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and stared at the calendar. The days all looked the same, blank squares filled with no plans. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, something inside her shifted. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was recognition. She hadn't lost her family. She'd been cut out of it. And that realization, sharp and precise, was more powerful than grief. Because grief says this is gone forever. But being erased means maybe, just maybe, you can write yourself back in. If you're willing to pick up the pen. The storm came without warning, one of those sudden spring tantrums where the sky cracked open and wept without apology. Evelyn hadn't even seen the clouds coming. One minute she was rinsing a chipped teacup in the sink, and the next thunder was rattling the windows like an angry guest demanding entry. She turned off the faucet and peered out the window. Rain blurred the world outside into a watercolor wash of gray and silver. Wind howled down the street, sweeping stray leaves into frantic spirals. The kind of weather that made you grateful for walls, for shelter. And then she saw him. At first she thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow flitting between parked cars. But no, it was a child. Small, hoodless arms wrapped around himself, stumbling near the edge of the sidewalk, just yards from the train tracks. Evelyn's breath caught. There were no adults in sight, no umbrella, no direction. Just this boy, half drenched, half running his sneakers, slapping wet pavement as he moved closer to the crosswalk. Then, God help her, he veered toward the road, toward the tracks. Headlights flashed in the distance. The wail of a train horn split the air. "Hey!" Evelyn screamed louder than she'd thought herself capable of. Her voice bounced off brick and concrete, but the boy didn't stop. She didn't think. She just moved. Out the door, down the stoop, bare feet hitting cold concrete. The rain was a slap across the face. Her cardigan ballooned around her like a kite trying to lift off. She ran harder than her knees allowed. She ran like her bones didn't remember they were 68 years old. "Stop!" she shouted again, just as the boy's foot hit the first rail. She caught him by the back of his shirt, yanked him backward, stumbled and fell hard on her hip, pulling him down with her. The train roared past a second later. Metal thunder, screaming steel, a gust of heat and noise that rushed over them like judgment. The boy was sobbing. So was Evelyn. For a long moment, they just sat there soaked and stunned. The rain didn't care. It kept falling, indifferent to near deaths and old women lying on sidewalks. "Are you hurt?" she asked, panting. Her voice trembled more than her hands. The boy shook his head, rubbing his eyes with the sleeve of a too small jacket. "What's your name?" she asked gently this time. He hesitated, then sniffed. "Finn." She blinked. "Finn what?" "I don't know," he said. "Just Finn." "Where's your mom?" "I don't have one." That hit her like a second train. She pushed herself up slowly, groaning as her hip protested. "Okay, Finn. Let's get out of this rain." Her apartment was only half a block away. She half carried, half guided him up the steps, and inside, dripping onto the welcome mat that hadn't welcomed anyone in months. She wrapped him in a towel, gave him a mug of warm milk, and sat him on the worn-out recliner across from her. He was maybe 5, 6 at most. His jeans were muddy, his socks mismatched, his t-shirt clung to his thin frame. But his eyes, those eyes, Evelyn froze. They were Monroe eyes, hazel flecked with gold, Gerald's eyes, Carla's eyes. Her hands shook as she set down the milk. "You don't have a mom," she repeated carefully. "I live with my Aunt Carla," Finn said between sips. "She says I'm a handful, so I can't go to school with Daniel." The air changed. Aunt Carla, Daniel. She leaned forward, keeping her tone light. "Do you know Daniel's last name?" Monroe Finn said without hesitation. "Like on my medicine bottle." She swallowed hard. "Can I see your bottle, sweetheart?" He pulled a tiny backpack from the floor and unzipped it with sticky fingers. Inside was a half-smashed PB&J sandwich, a pack of crayons, and a yellow prescription bottle labeled in blocky pharmacy font. Finn Monroe, DOB 071126. Take once daily for seasonal asthma. Evelyn took a picture with trembling hands. Then she excused herself to the kitchen and leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. Monroe, a child she'd never met. A child Carla had never mentioned. A child whose existence had been quietly folded into the shadows. Why? Why keep one child public and another hidden? Unless... Evelyn's stomach turned. She returned to the living room and knelt beside him. "Finn, do you know your mommy's name?" He looked confused, like she'd asked him something too abstract. "Carla takes care of me," he said finally. "She says, my mom went away 'cause she made bad choices." "Do you remember your mom?" He shook his head. "But Carla says I look just like her." He did, except he didn't. He looked like Gerald. He looked like her. And then he said it, so simply, so devastatingly. "Carla says I'm not allowed to see the bad grandma, 'cause the bad grandma makes trouble." Evelyn blinked. "What?" "She says the bad grandma always tries to ruin things, that she's mad all the time and nobody likes her." The words landed like stones in her chest. Bad grandma. So that's who she was now. Finn yawned and curled up under the towel. Evelyn watched him fall asleep on her couch, his thumb slipping into his mouth, his brow relaxed into the peace only children possess. She sat in silence for nearly an hour, not moving, not even crying. Then she rose, moved quietly to the kitchen drawer, and pulled out her phone. She opened the photo she had just taken. Finn Monroe. No question now. Carla had kept this child secret. Whether from shame, scandal, or something more sinister, Evelyn didn't yet know. But she knew this much: this boy was her grandson. And Carla had erased her not once but twice. This time Evelyn wasn't going to stay erased. This time the world was going to know she existed, and that she was no one's bad anything. The next morning Evelyn woke with a stiffness in her bones and a restlessness in her chest. The storm had passed, but the fog inside her hadn't lifted. Finn had curled up into the old armchair like he'd lived there his whole life, snoring softly under the same quilt Gerald used to nap beneath. He looked peaceful, but Evelyn's mind was anything but. She sat at the edge of the kitchen table, staring at the name on the prescription bottle again. Finn Monroe. The boy wasn't just a secret. He was a confession Carla had never made. Evelyn couldn't stop thinking about the way he had said it. How Carla called her the bad grandma. How she'd told the boy his mother made bad choices. Evelyn had seen enough fractured families to know when something didn't add up. And this wasn't just dysfunction. This was design, a deliberate omission. Carla had scrubbed this child from the official record. But why? She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to start. It had been years since she last saw Harold Eastman. He'd been their estate attorney for over 2 decades, formal, bookish, but deeply loyal to Gerald. The last time they'd spoken had been at Gerald's memorial, when he'd awkwardly offered to handle the financial loose ends with a kind of sterile compassion Evelyn had come to associate with men who never cried in public. She dug through the dusty Rolodex on her bookshelf until she found the card Harold Eastman, Eastman & Locke, LLP. Still on Belmont. Still in business. She called, expecting voicemail. He answered on the 3rd ring. Harold Eastman. Harold, it's Evelyn Monroe. There was a pause, just long enough to make her wonder if he was pretending not to know who she was. Evelyn, he said finally. Well, it's been a while. Yes, it has. To what do I owe? I need to ask about something you might still be holding for Gerald, she said. Something he didn't want going through Carla. Another pause. Then you'd better come in. The office hadn't changed much. Dark leather furniture, shelves lined with dusty legal tomes that no one had read in decades. A grandfather clock ticked in the corner like it had since the 1970s. Harold looked thinner, older, but his eyes were sharp as ever. "I'll get straight to it," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Your husband left behind an unusual item, not a standard clause or codicil. It wasn't in the official will." "What was it?" He reached into a locked cabinet behind his desk and pulled out a manila envelope thick and bound with a red string. "He delivered this personally," Harold said, 2 weeks before he died. "Told me not to open it unless someone came asking who the real heir to his values should be." Evelyn frowned. "What does that mean?" Harold opened the envelope carefully and removed a sealed letter attached to what looked like a blank cashier's check. "This," he said, laying it gently on the desk, "is a certified bank draft. It's dated, notarized, and has no payee listed. Value $1 million. Evelyn stared at it like it might catch fire. He said Harold continued that this money was not to go to Carla under any circumstances. He wanted it held until someone who understood him came asking. He said you would know what to do with it. Evelyn's throat tightened. "May I read the letter?" Harold nodded. She slipped off the wax seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. Gerald's. It wasn't a long letter, just a few lines. "Evelyn, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and something's gone wrong. I couldn't stop Carla from becoming what she's become. But I trust you. This check is real. But don't give it to her. Don't give it to anyone who sees family as a transaction. Look for the child who knows how to love. You'll know when you see them. That's the one." Gee, her hands shook as she folded it back up. "Did Carla know about this?" she asked quietly. Harold shook his head. "Not directly. I told her there were no unusual assets left outside the will," which was technically true. "So legally, you can assign it to anyone. The funds are yours to direct." It was Gerald's way of bypassing the machinery. Evelyn blinked back tears. He always hated machinery. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of it all pressing down like wet wool. Then Harold added, "Can I ask what brought this on now?" Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She showed him the photo of Finn's prescription bottle. Then the photo she'd secretly taken of him, sleeping on her couch that morning. "This child," she said, voice cracking. "His name is Finn Monroe. He's been living in Carla's house, but she never told anyone he existed." Harold furrowed his brow. "But Carla only has one legal child. Daniel. She filed declarations during probate, swore under penalty of perjury that she had only one dependent, because having a second child would have meant a reassessment of Gerald's estate." Evelyn said, the realization sinking in, and possibly risked her inheritance. Her husband's family insisted on a clean paper trail, and an out-of-wedlock child would have complicated that, Harold added grimly. "She erased him," Evelyn whispered, "just like she erased me." Harold leaned back in his chair. "If that child is Gerald's bloodline, if his name is Monroe—" "It is," she said. "I'm sure of it." He tapped the blank check. "Then you know what you have to do." On the bus ride home, Evelyn held the envelope in her lap like it was made of gold leaf and secrets. The other passengers didn't look twice at her, just another old woman in a world too fast to notice her. But she felt taller, heavier, anchored by the letter in her bag and the choice it demanded. Look for the child who knows how to love. She had. She'd pulled him from a storm, made him milk, watched him fall asleep under Gerald's quilt. She didn't need a DNA test. She had something better. She had proof of heart. And Gerald, dear, stubborn Gerald, had trusted her to recognize it when she saw it. She would not fail him, not this time, not again. It happened on a Thursday morning, clear skies, the kind of false blue that always made Evelyn suspicious. There was something deceptive about days that looked too calm on the surface. She was washing the breakfast dishes, humming a melody Gerald used to play on the piano when the doorbell rang. Not a knock, a ring, clean, direct, intentional. She dried her hands slowly, heart ticking faster with each step toward the door. When she opened it, Carla stood on the threshold wrapped in a beige trench coat. Sunglasses perched high on her head like a crown. Her makeup was perfect, her expression choreographed. "Mom," she said, breathy like she'd run from the car. Evelyn stared at her daughter for a long beat, as if the years apart had rearranged her features. Carla had always been poised, but now there was something more brittle in her beauty, like a porcelain figurine that had been glued together one too many times. Evelyn stepped aside. Carla entered. The house had never felt smaller. "I know I should have called." Carla began smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her coat. "But I read something from Harold about a letter A, possible inheritance." There it was. No preamble, no apology, just a soft-spoken inquiry wrapped in the perfume of concern. Evelyn said nothing. She let the silence do the heavy lifting. Carla sat on the edge of the couch like she wasn't sure it was clean. "I know things haven't been easy between us," she continued. "And that's my fault. I take full responsibility. But Daniel, he asks about you, Mom. He really does." Evelyn almost laughed. Instead, she walked into the kitchen, pressed a button on the small digital recorder hidden beneath a pot holder, and returned with 2 cups of tea. The recorder hummed to life silently. She placed it on the windowsill behind Carla's head, invisible from the couch. "I'm sure Daniel's a good boy," Evelyn said calmly, handing Carla a mug. Carla took it, though she didn't sip, too busy calculating. "I just think," she said, smiling carefully, "that if you're considering allocating funds, you should think about who will carry the family name, who will honor Grandpa Gerald's legacy. Like Daniel." "Yes, exactly." Evelyn sat down opposite her. "And Finn." Carla's fingers tensed around the mug. The pause was sharp. "Finn," she echoed. "Mom." "You said Daniel would carry the family name. So what about Finn?" Carla blinked. Her lashes fluttered, a performance move Evelyn had seen in 100 PTA meetings. "Finn isn't—" She hesitated. "It's complicated." "Is he family?" Carla looked down. "He's biologically, yes, but not legally. He's not recognized in any formal documentation tied to the estate, so he's invisible. That's not fair, isn't it?" Carla stood, her voice sharpening. "I'm trying to do what's best for everyone involved. This isn't about favoritism, it's about structure, about order, about inheritance." Evelyn cut in soft but lethal. Carla flushed. "I'm not asking for myself," she insisted. "But Daniel, he deserves stability. He's the one who's always been part of this family. Publicly, legally. You can't just hand over $1 million to a child no one even knows exists." Evelyn leaned forward. "But you know he exists." Carla didn't answer. "Why did you hide him?" The room thickened. "I didn't hide him," Carla snapped. "I omitted details for clarity, for protection, for money." "That's not fair." "Then say his name." Carla's mouth worked, but no sound came out. "Say it," Evelyn repeated. "Say Finn Monroe is my son." Carla closed her eyes. Then finally, "Fine. Yes, he's my son. But he wasn't supposed to be." Evelyn felt her stomach clench. Carla sat back down, setting the tea on the table like it had betrayed her. "I was 23, she said. "It was stupid. A mistake. His father didn't stick around, and I wasn't going to let that one bad decision ruin everything I'd built." "So you gave him away?" "No. I left him with a friend. A quiet arrangement. She couldn't have children. It made sense at the time. But then she died. Car accident. And Finn came back. Temporarily." "Temporarily," Evelyn echoed. Carla sighed. "Then I met Eric. And his family, they're traditional. They made it very clear that their money was for a clean legacy. One child. Proper paperwork. No scandals. No surprises." "So you erased your son?" "I protected my future." Evelyn stared at her, mouth dry. "Do you even love him?" Carla's jaw tightened. "Love doesn't pay for private school. Love doesn't keep your name off tabloid websites. You think I had a choice?" "You had 1,000 choices. You just made the worst ones." Carla stood abruptly. "Look, I came here to make peace, to suggest something reasonable. You put that money in a trust for Daniel. Everyone wins. You're remembered as generous. Gerald's name lives on, and we keep things manageable." "And Finn?" Carla paused at the door. "That child," she said, her voice cold, "was never meant to exist in this system." Evelyn didn't follow her to the door. She didn't stop her from leaving. She just stared at the blinking red light on the recorder behind the curtain. And for the first time in a long time, she smiled. She hesitated for a full minute before hitting send. The email sat open on her screen. The audio file of Carla's confession attached the subject line typed in all caps. A family erased. A story that needs to be told. It wasn't rage that made her send it. It was clarity, and a kind of mourning for everything she had allowed herself to be erased from. A million tiny silences swallowed year after year until there was nothing left but the echo of her own restraint. She clicked send and waited. 3 hours later, the producer from Channel 9's Portland Today called. "We listened to the recording," the woman said, breathless. "And we want to feature your story. Not as a gossip piece, this is bigger than that. This is about legacy, about the silent roles women are pushed into, about truth." Evelyn agreed, not for herself, for Finn, for the boy who didn't know his own birthright, for the child described as an error in his mother's architecture of wealth. They scheduled a live segment the following evening. Studio lights, 2 cameras, a stool too tall for comfort, and a glass of water Evelyn barely touched. Behind her, a single image was projected on a wide screen, Finn asleep on her couch, cradling Gerald's old quilt. The moment the red on-air sign lit up, Evelyn's heart steadied not out of confidence but necessity. The host, Melissa Nguyen, gave her a warm smile and began, "Tonight we bring you a very special guest. Evelyn Monroe, retired art teacher and widow of prominent developer Gerald Monroe, is here to share a deeply personal story, one about love loss and what it truly means to be family." Melissa turned to her. "Mrs. Monroe, thank you for being here." Evelyn nodded, clasping her hands in her lap. "Thank you for having me. I understand you taught art in Portland for over 30 years. 36, Evelyn said. "I taught thousands of students. Drew their portraits, remembered each face, still do." "That's incredible," Melissa said. "But something struck me in your message to us. You wrote, 'I have drawn every child but the one I love most.'" Evelyn's voice wavered just slightly. "Yes, I've never drawn my grandson." "Why?" "Because I've never been allowed to know him." A ripple of silence moved across the studio. Melissa leaned in. "Tell us about that." Evelyn drew a breath. "My daughter Carla made the decision to erase me from her life after my husband passed away. She claimed I was emotionally unstable, that I'd complicate her family structure. I respected her space. I stayed quiet. I kept sending letters, cards, gifts. All of them came back unopened. Return to sender." She looked straight into the camera. "Then one night during a storm, I saw a boy nearly hit by a train. I ran into the rain and pulled him out of the path just in time. I took him home, fed him, dried him off." She reached into her purse and pulled out a framed print of Finn asleep with chocolate smeared on his cheek. "That boy's name is Finn." She held the photo up. "He told me he lived with my daughter Carla, that she wasn't his mom, that he wasn't allowed to see the bad grandma. That's what he called me, the bad grandma, a phrase he didn't invent, one he'd been fed." Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she set the photo down. "I was confused. So I asked questions, quietly. I found out he shares my husband's last name, that he's on medication Carla administers, that his legal records list him as Finn Monroe. My husband's name, my name." Melissa blinked, visibly stunned. "Your daughter never told you she had another child?" "No," Evelyn said. "Because if she had, she would have risked losing her husband's family's fortune. Their legacy required a neat picture, one child, no gaps, no early mistakes, and certainly no inconvenient grandparents." A hush fell again. Melissa hesitated, then said softly, "And yet, you're here publicly telling this story. Why now?" Evelyn paused. Then she reached into her coat pocket and produced a small envelope. "This was left by my husband. A check for $1 million. No recipient named. Just a note. Find the child who knows how to love." She looked at the camera again. "I found him." The screen behind her flickered again and audio waveform appeared. Then Carla's voice filled the studio. "That child was never meant to exist in this system." Gasps echoed off stage. Melissa looked stunned. "That's your daughter?" "Yes." "Do you know how serious this is?" "I do," Evelyn said. "But it's not more serious than what she's done to Finn." Melissa's voice cracked slightly. "What do you hope comes from this?" Evelyn's answer came without hesitation. "I hope people understand that family isn't about blood tests and paperwork. It's not about legal status or who makes it into the Christmas card. Family is about who shows up in the storm, who reaches for you without needing to be asked. She leaned forward. I was a teacher for 3 decades. I've met hundreds of children, some hurt, some healing, but the ones who always remembered me, who came back years later, were the ones who were loved early and loved consistently. She looked at the host, at the crew, at the quiet frozen rows of faces off camera, and finally back into the lens. Finn may not be Carla's perfect child. He may not be easy to explain at cocktail parties, but he is mine, and I will not let him be forgotten. The screen faded to black behind her. A single sentence appeared, spoken in Evelyn's voice. Family isn't who's legal. Family is who runs into traffic to save your child from a train. Silence. And then the phone started ringing. The emails flooded in. Portland and beyond was listening. By the time Evelyn returned home from the studio that night, her voicemail was full. Not from Carla, not from Daniel, but from strangers. Dozens of them. Women, grandparents, former students, journalists, even a few attorneys. One voice shook as it said, "You reminded me of my grandmother. She raised me when no one else would. Thank you for not letting them erase you." Another, "I have a daughter just like Carla. I thought I was alone." But the flood hadn't even crested yet. By sunrise, the video clip of Evelyn on Channel 9 had gone viral. It ricocheted across Facebook, exploded on Reddit, and climbed into trending topics on X within 12 hours under the hashtag #FamilyIsWhoStays. Clips of Carla's voice, her exact phrasing, "that child was never meant to exist in this system," were looped endlessly over montages of Finn's photo and Evelyn's final quote. People were furious, not just at Carla, at what she represented. The pristine, curated version of motherhood that sacrificed humanity for status. The kind of parental image that looked clean on the outside and wrought black underneath. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, hands trembling as she scrolled through the storm. The press had picked it up. First the local papers, then the national ones. Portland Weekly ran a front-page story, "Millionaire's Widow Breaks Silence, the Grandchild No One Knew About." Then came the big outlets. The New York Times, "Love Over Legality." The woman who said no to a sanitized family tree. CNN, "She saved a boy in the rain, then discovered he was her grandson." But it wasn't just media attention. It was the law. 2 days after the broadcast, Evelyn received a formal notice from the Multnomah County Probate Court. The estate of Gerald Monroe was being re-examined under Section 17D, which allowed for ethical clause reviews when new and substantial information regarding direct lineage is presented. The legal wording was cold, but the implication wasn't. Carla's silence had officially become an open question of fraud. She'd sworn under penalty of perjury that Daniel was her only child. The court now had evidence both from Evelyn and independently verified that Finn Monroe had existed all along, and was not only biologically hers, but also bore the Monroe surname, appeared in pharmacy records, and had been living in her household without acknowledgement or protection. Even worse, her recorded statement broadcast nationwide confirmed intent. Carla wasn't just guilty of omission. She was guilty of concealment for gain. That same week, Evelyn was contacted by a representative from the Monroe Family Trust, Gerald's old in-laws Eric's side. She recognized the voice immediately, Miriam Lefroy, matriarch, the same woman who once told Evelyn, "We believe in decorum over drama." Miriam didn't mince words. "We will be reviewing Carla's access to the trust," she said. There were very clear clauses about moral fitness and full disclosure of heirs. She has violated both. Evelyn didn't gloat. She didn't feel triumphant, just tired. But something else arrived that afternoon that made her knees go weak. A second envelope from the Department of Child Welfare. Inside a letter, "Notice of temporary custodial reevaluation, subject Finn Monroe." The letter stated that Carla's custodial rights over Finn had been suspended, pending a full investigation into potential child identity suppression and emotional endangerment. Finn was now in temporary state care with strong recommendation toward relative placement. Relative, meaning Evelyn. There at the bottom of the page were the words she'd stopped hoping to see. Proposed kinship placement. Evelyn Monroe, maternal grandmother. She set the paper down slowly like it might break. This wasn't revenge. It was repair. But the fallout for Carla was far from over. By the end of the week, Eric Monroe filed for a legal separation. The news leaked fast. Sources close to the Monroe family told reporters Eric had been unaware of Finn's existence. He hadn't even known Carla had been pregnant before their marriage. He had assumed, as had the rest of the trust, that Daniel was their first child. That lie was enough. The Monroe family, image-conscious and politically active, moved swiftly. Carla was locked out of key financial accounts. She was suspended from the board of a nonprofit she helped found. And perhaps most brutally of all, her access to Daniel was reduced to supervised visits while her mental health was evaluated. The court labeled it emotional destabilization of minor dependents due to concealed lineage. The phrasing was clinical, but what it meant was she broke the trust of 2 children and of the system she'd built her identity upon. In interviews, Carla gave prepared statements. She said she had been overwhelmed, that early motherhood was traumatic, that decisions made in youth do not define a person's value as a parent. But America had heard her voice already, the one that had said that child was never meant to exist in this system. No PR firm could clean that up. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat in her small living room, watching all of it unfold, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet, stunned grief. This wasn't what she had wanted. She never dreamed of seeing her daughter collapse under the weight of her own ambition. But the truth was now undeniable. Carla had buried a child to protect a lie, and the world had finally dug him back up. Evelyn looked at the calendar on the wall. Next week, Finn would be coming home. It was a Tuesday morning when Evelyn heard the knock, not the tentative rattle of a delivery driver or the hollow courtesy of a neighbor with a misplaced package. This was different, 3 slow, deliberate raps on the wood, as if the air between them already knew something important was about to pass through. She set down her tea, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked slowly to the door. Through the peephole, she saw a woman in a navy blazer, stern but kind eyes, and beside her, standing just behind her hip, was a small boy with a backpack too big for his frame and a look on his face that said he wasn't quite sure if he was in trouble or being rescued. Evelyn opened the door. "Mrs. Monroe," the woman asked. She nodded. "I'm Teresa Vaughn, Department of Child and Family Services. We spoke on the phone." She smiled gently. "Finn's here for your scheduled kinship visit." Evelyn's eyes drifted down, and there he was. Finn, shoes too tight, hair unbrushed, a little scab on his chin. But those eyes, those Monroe eyes, wide and watching, they stared at each other for a second that stretched like fabric caught in the wind. Then he spoke. "Are you my grandma?" Evelyn's throat tightened. She knelt slowly until they were eye level. "I am," she whispered. "Yes, I'm your grandmother." Finn's lower lip quivered, but he didn't cry. He simply stepped forward just a few inches and said, "Mom said you were mean, but you don't look mean." "I'm not mean," Evelyn said softly. "I've just been waiting for you." And then finally he moved. He walked into her arms. Not a leap, not a run, just a quiet surrender. She held him for a long time, her fingers wrapping around the bones of his back, her heart catching up to a beat it hadn't felt in years. Teresa smiled, nodded once, and stepped back onto the porch. "I'll be back in 2 hours. Take your time." They stood in the hallway for a moment longer, Evelyn afraid that if she let go, it would all vanish again. But Finn gently pulled back, looked at her seriously, and said, "You smell like crayons." She laughed full and sudden. "That's probably because I used to be a teacher." He looked around the living room. "This is your house." "For now," she said. "It's small." "It's full," she replied. "You want to see something special?" He nodded. She led him to the back room, her studio. The walls were lined with portraits. Children of every background, every smile, every future. Some with glitter still stuck to the canvas. Some with edges curled from years of sunlight. But there was a spot, just one corner, that had been left blank. She walked over to a shelf and pulled down a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in blue velvet, was a single paintbrush. Not new, not even clean, its bristles frayed handle darkened by decades of use. "This," she said, kneeling again, "belonged to your Grandpa Gerald. He was an artist too, a builder, a dreamer. He used to say the best things in life were made with your hands." Finn looked at the brush like it was magic. "What do I do with it?" he asked. She smiled. "Anything you want." He chose a small easel near the window, dipped the brush into the water, and stared at the blank paper for a long time. Evelyn didn't say a word. She let him listen to the silence, let him hear his own thoughts, and then he began. Slow, unsure strokes at first, circles, dots, then shapes, then something that looked like a person, then 3. Evelyn stood behind him, hands clasped. He turned around after 20 minutes, cheeks flushed, fingers stained. "I made something," he said. She knelt again, bracing. "What is it, sweetheart?" He pointed. "That's me," he said, tapping the smallest figure. "And that's Daniel. He's my brother, right?" Evelyn's breath caught. He didn't say half-brother, didn't ask permission to believe it. And that he said, touching the tallest figure in the middle, "That's you." She looked closer. The drawing was simple, childlike, but in it the tallest figure had long gray hair, a wide smile, and a big red heart on the chest. The words scribbled above it read, "My new family." Her knees buckled slightly, and she caught herself on the edge of the table. Finn stared at her, unsure if he'd done something wrong. But she reached out, pulled him into her again, and said over and over, "You did everything right." They spent the next hour talking about colors, animals, space, aliens, and why grown-ups always made life too complicated. He asked if she had any pets. She said not yet. He asked if she could make pancakes with smiley faces. She said she'd try. And when Teresa returned, he clung to Evelyn's hand. "Do I have to go?" he whispered. "Just for now," she said. "But I can come back." "Yes," she said. "You're coming home soon." He looked up at her. "Promise." She placed Gerald's brush in his hand. "On everything that matters." Evelyn placed the check on the kitchen table like it was a relic from another life. It didn't look like much, simple paper, cream-colored, printed with dark navy ink and a notary seal that had already begun to fade around the edges. But that rectangle held $1 million and 1 million decisions. It was signed, stamped, ready, except for one thing. The name. The payee line sat empty, a blank space at the end of a promise waiting to be filled. Her pen hovered over it more than once, but she always stopped. Not because she didn't know who deserved it, but because it meant letting go of who didn't. She had spent a week thinking, a week replaying Carla's voice in her head. The clinical cruelty of that child was never meant to exist in this system. The performance, the careful choreography of her daughter's image, the way she had measured family by inheritance, love by legality. And she'd spent the same week watching Finn draw. He had returned every afternoon since that first visit, easel under the window, a plate of apple slices beside him, Gerald's old brush in hand. He painted with his tongue poking out, eyes squinting the exact same way his grandfather used to hammer nails or shape wood. No one had taught him that. It lived in him. One afternoon she asked, "What are you drawing today?" He said without looking up, "A place where no one hides anybody." She swallowed. That night she wrote the letter, not typed, handwritten, because some things needed to carry the weight of ink. "Harold, this is not just about money. You knew Gerald. You knew what he valued. He didn't build buildings, he built bridges. He used tools, not titles, to define a man. I will not keep this check. I will not use it to chase comfort. I am naming Finn Monroe as the recipient, not because he is my blood, though he is. Not because he is the child of my daughter, though biologically that is true. But because he is the only one who has walked into my life with nothing but open hands and honest questions. He doesn't carry Carla's name, but he carries the spirit of this family, its stubbornness, its kindness, and most of all, its heart. I ask that this money be transformed into something larger. Not a single account, but a legacy. Establish the Gerald Monroe Foundation for Creative Youth. Make it a scholarship, a mentorship, a refuge for kids like Finn who were nearly erased. Let it carry Gerald's name, and let Finn be its first steward. The boy doesn't need to inherit a fortune. He needs to inherit the freedom to be seen. Use the check, use the name, but let the story be ours. Evelyn. She folded it once, sealed it in a blue envelope, and slid the check inside. Then she called Harold's office and asked to speak directly. He was quiet for a long time after she read the letter to him. Then he cleared his throat and said, "It'll be done by Friday." True to his word, by week's end, the paperwork was finalized. The Gerald Monroe Foundation for Creative Youth was born an art scholarship and youth outreach program dedicated to underserved children with creative gifts. Its mission was simple: to ensure no child with a voice is ever erased again. The launch announcement was sent to every school board in Oregon. And when it came time to assign the honorary founding seat, the symbolic first guardian of the foundation, Evelyn sent them Finn's name. Not with a photo, not with a resume. Just a sentence. He knows how to love. That was the only requirement. When the nonprofit board asked if they could host a small event to announce the fund, Evelyn declined. No galas, no flashbulbs. She asked for something smaller, quieter. She wanted a letter printed on foundation letterhead that Finn could open on his birthday. It arrived in the mail 3 days later. Inside a note written in soft blue ink. Dear Finn, you are the beginning of something good. This world can be loud, fast, harsh, but your art slows it down, makes it kind again. You now carry a piece of a story that started long before you were born, and you get to shape where it goes next. Use your voice, use your hands, but most of all, use your heart. Welcome to the Evelyn Monroe Foundation. You're not just part of the family, you're the future of it. Evelyn folded the letter with trembling fingers and slid it into a red envelope with a silver ribbon. That night, Finn stayed over for the first time. They watched cartoons, made spaghetti that clumped too much, fell asleep on the same couch where she'd once drawn her husband's face by candlelight. In the dark, just before drifting off, Finn asked Grandma, "Yes, why did you give me the money?" She hesitated, then turned to him, brushing a curl from his forehead. "Because she said you were never meant to be hidden. You were meant to be found." He didn't respond, just curled closer to her side, and finally slept without flinching. The knock came after midnight. Not polite, not hesitant, not angry. Just hollow. Evelyn was awake. She hadn't really been sleeping much, not since the foundation announcement, not since Finn's first night in her care, not since the quiet realization that peace and heartbreak sometimes shared the same room. She opened the door slowly, and there beneath the porch light stood Carla. No makeup, no jewelry, no shield. Just a woman with swollen eyes clutching herself against the cold. The wind didn't lift her hair the way it used to in her staged family photos. It clung to her cheeks damp with tears. Evelyn said nothing. She waited. Carla stepped forward. "Mom," she whispered, I messed everything up." Still Evelyn didn't speak. Carla's voice cracked. "I lost Daniel. Eric filed full custody. The board removed me. The press calls every day. I can't walk my street without feeling like I'm in a glass case." A pause, then a shiver. "I have nothing left." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in ache. "No," she said softly. "You do have something left." Carla looked up hopeful. "What?" "You still have a choice," Evelyn said. "To change, or to perform remorse." Carla's chin trembled. She stepped inside slowly, shoes soaked, shoulders sunken. In the living room, Finn was asleep on the couch, curled up in his favorite blanket, Gerald's old brush tucked beside him like a security toy. Carla dropped to her knees beside him, and for the first time in her life, Evelyn watched her daughter become smaller than her mistakes. She didn't reach for the boy, didn't try to wake him. She just bowed her head, hands trembling, and whispered, "I never wanted to hurt him." Evelyn crossed her arms. "That's not true," she said, her voice sharp but steady. "You hurt him the moment you decided he wasn't convenient. You didn't protect him, you erased him." Erased. Carla didn't flinch. She nodded. "I know." A moment passed. Then, too, the clock ticked like it had been holding its breath for years. Evelyn softened just slightly. "You lost things that can be rebuilt," she said. "But you threw away things that never should have been discarded." Carla looked up, her eyes swollen, her lips bloodless. She looked nothing like the woman who once wore tailored suits and offered sound bites to charity photographers. She looked like someone undone. "I don't deserve to be his mother anymore," she whispered. And just as Evelyn opened her mouth to reply, Finn stirred. He didn't fully wake, just blinked once, then reached out in his half-dreaming state and murmured, "Mom, don't leave Grandma again, okay?" Carla's mouth fell open, soundless. Her hand hovered near his cheek but didn't touch. Evelyn's heart cracked. Not from blame, but from something older. The grief of a mother who had raised a daughter on art and truth only to watch her learn performance and denial instead. She walked over, kneeling beside Carla, not to comfort her, but to sit at the same height. "He dreams better than we've lived," she said. Carla nodded, tears slipping silently. "I don't want to be shut out anymore," she said, "even if I don't deserve in." Evelyn looked at her, long, hard, then said the only thing that could be said. "Then stop talking and start doing." Carla leaned her head against the couch next to her sleeping son, and for the first time in years, Evelyn let the silence sit between them, not as punishment, but as peace. She didn't say she forgave her. She didn't need to, because some things weren't about saying. They were about staying, and that night she stayed. They all did. The gallery smelled of fresh paint and possibility. It wasn't grand. Just a repurposed library turned into a community arts center, new walls over old whispers. But that night it was brighter than any cathedral. Not because of the chandeliers, which there weren't, or the music, which was just a quiet cello track looped through a speaker, but because every canvas hanging on the wall had a beating story behind it, and one of them, framed in a modest white wooden border centered under soft golden lights, had a plaque beneath it that read, "Untitled Check, by Evelyn Monroe, age 8. It was watercolor, rough around the edges, no perfect lines. Just a storm of color, deep blue at the bottom, a rising swirl of gold near the top, and in the center a faint outline of a family holding hands. There was no currency, no dollar signs, but in the upper right corner, written in a child's uneven hand, was the word value. No signature, no name attached. Because that was the point. Evelyn stood just a few steps away, her hands folded in front of her heart, pacing faster than her breath. The room had gathered quietly, a mix of families, students, teachers, community members. No paparazzi, no microphones, just neighbors, strangers, witnesses. She waited until the hum died down, then stepped forward. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began. Her voice was steady but soft, like a brush against canvas. "My name is Evelyn Monroe. I used to teach art in this city. For decades I painted children who believed they mattered, and then for a while I stopped, because I forgot I did too." She paused, eyes glancing toward Finn, who stood near Daniel, both wearing button-up shirts and mismatched ties. Finn's hands were clasped, bouncing nervously. Evelyn continued, "This piece behind me was painted by my grandson Finn. He's 8 years old. He loves grapes, outer space, and anything with dragons. But this," she gestured behind her, "this is what he made when I gave him the chance to show the world what love looks like." She stepped aside, letting the painting fill the frame again. "It's called Untitled Check, and it's named for the one I chose not to cash." A few people tilted their heads, unsure. Evelyn smiled. "There was a check," she said. "A big one. A life-changing one. And no name written on it. Just a promise to give it to the person who proved they understood what family meant." She looked toward Finn again. "I didn't pick the one with the best resume. I didn't pick the one who showed up with lawyers. I picked the one who ran through the rain and asked if I was the grandma he was told not to love." The crowd was silent. Some shifted. One woman clutched her coat tighter. Evelyn's voice softened. "This is what value looks like. Not ink on paper, but color on canvas. Not who gets the inheritance, but who chooses to be present." She took a deep breath. "And to anyone out there who's been erased, who's been told they don't belong because they don't fit the picture, this is for you." A hush fell over the room. Then a ripple of applause, small at first, then growing. Finn's cheeks turned red. Daniel grinned and nudged him forward. And suddenly Evelyn felt them. Hands, one on each side. Daniel on her left, Finn on her right. And in that moment, just that one suspended breath in time, 3 generations stood before a painting not about wealth, but worth. Finn whispered, "Did I do okay?" Evelyn bent down slightly. "You made the room see," she said, "and that's the most any artist can hope for." A photographer captured it. Not a posed shot. Just the 3 of them, backs to the audience, facing the painting. Warm light spilling over their shoulders. The hush of 100 strangers holding their breath behind them. No drama, no stage, just 3 silhouettes and one truth, that families don't need signatures, they need courage. The lights dimmed slightly as the next artist took the floor. Evelyn placed her hand gently on Finn's shoulder, and finally she exhaled, not from exhaustion, but from peace.